second time recording this today, so hopefully it goes okay. So I made this like 2 or 3 weeks ago and have just been sitting on it for a variety of reasons. And the first one being I can do what I want. So this is the second Operation Paperclip Nazi that I've compiled a full PowerPoint on. I have a list of like, oh my god, a lot. A lot with just like bare bones information to look over next time and try to locate stuff in any of my books first. But anyway, yeah, so he's the second one that I researched, and I just want to put a disclaimer because I saw that his youngest son was active on the Wikipedia speech talks or whatever section. This is for entertainment purposes only. Yeah. Let's move on past the title slide. So, here's his whitewashed timeline. God, it looks weird having my right side on the left. Ugh. Sorry, I'm very vain. So, let's just dive into this. His whitewashed, so bare bones, if you go looking for stuff about him, this is what you're going to find on the surface. Yeah. So, May 15th, 1913, he was born in Mannheim, Germany. His father was the director of a sugar producing company. I didn't put the name of it here because I didn't want to labor through pronouncing the German name, but it's very easily searchable. It's in multiple of his online life summaries, but basically it's one of the biggest sugar producers in Germany. So pretty nice. He probably lived a pretty nice life. In 1932, so he started studying physics in Leipzig, Heidelberg, and Berlin. Nothing too crazy there. He was just a college student, right? 1933, he joined I decided to suffer through the German this time, I guess. He joined the Fliegersturm der SS, a Nazi organization set up to train military pilots. He volunteered for the Luftwaffe in 1934. Just to make a note of it, I'm not sure if people watching this are aware of the date that World War II started on. It was September 1st, 1939. So this is 1933. Remember that there, as the part of the Treaty of Versailles, which Germany was angry about, they had an armistice agreement where they couldn't rearm themselves to the degree that they had been for World War I. So they could only have a certain amount of like troops at any time. I can't recall off the top of my head if their Air Force was completely abolished or not. Some factor was completely abolished. But yeah, it was a very small amount. And here they are in 1933, setting up organizations to train Germans as military pilots when they didn't even have any conflicts at that point either. And then he volunteered for the Luftwaffe in 1934, which, again, it was still peacetime, and they weren't really allowed to be doing this, but nobody said anything. I mean, people said stuff. They were like, hey, is Germany allowed to do this? And then politicians worldwide were like, not really, but we don't really want to like go to war again, which is understandable, but also cowardly. Like, you made them sign it, the least you should do is enforce it. Even if it was terrible in a lot of ways. 1939 to 1942, he was active in the invasion of Poland, which was the first act of the war, basically. And he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and First Class, respectively, which is kind of a big deal. It's the Iron Cross is like the medal that most people associate with the Nazi Party, because people who got it talked a lot about it, and people who found it as memorabilia talk about it a lot. And then he was shot down right after being promoted to captain. So there went his career in the flying part of the Air Force, but he was still in the Luftwaffe. But we'll get into that later. 1946 through 1952, he emigrated to the U.S. in 1946, and through that time period, he did pioneering work on space medicine with an old colleague, and worked for Walt Disney, which is, I mean, on the surface, it's like, oh wow, Walt Disney. February 13th, 1990. So, he died in Germany after a full life of writing science articles, TV shows, and performing memorable experiments. If I remember correctly, I think I wrote it down somewhere in the PowerPoint. We'll see. My memory is just, it's all over the place. I'm pretty sure that the TV show that he did was like one that made science like more simplistic for people to understand, and did it in like an interesting way, apparently. So it was like hugely popular. And then he was doing like, I think I wrote down what his experiments were too. If not, I didn't feel they were important, and you can find them yourself. Just to be blunt. So, here's what they don't tell you. Heinz Haber was part of several Nazi organizations, but he wasn't part of the NASDAP itself. So that makes it totally okay, right? Like, he wasn't a Nazi, you know? I mean, he wasn't in the Nazi party. It's okay to bring him to the U.S., right? I'm not a Nazi. It's fine. However, you didn't have to be a member of the Nazi political party to be a Nazi. The political party was like, it was and wasn't all of Germany, basically. Like, there were people who didn't join the party ever and didn't join any of the organizations. And there were people who just joined the party for like the benefits and didn't join any of the running of the country stuff, like the stuff that went into everything. Like, that was an option. But he joined a bunch of Nazi organizations, which in my mind, he's a Nazi. Like, that makes him definitely a Nazi. And testimonies about him portray him as an avid, outspoken, I can't think of the word, so I'll just say outspoken lover of the Nazi ideology. So again, that would seem to appear to point towards him being a Nazi. The colleague that he collaborated with, that I mentioned in the timeline previously, but not by name, that he collaborated with in space medicine when he was working at NASA, was Hubertus Struckhold. I just know it's sh for ST. He was another Nazi scientist. If you know anything about Nazis, this is probably a big name for you. He was a scientist that was like the head honcho for, well, we'll continue. Struckhold was in charge of Haber, who was his protege, his favorite little little scientist, I guess. He was in charge of him, as well as a number of other scientists, like a lot, in Germany. And he is in part responsible for the human experimentation at Dachau. That's what I was talking about, yeah. And then, finally, in the talk section, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, in the talk section of Wikipedia, Haber's youngest son says that he has never heard of his father's alleged experiments. There's actually like an argument on there if you're interested to like go look at the gossip. But it's unsurprising that he wouldn't tell his family, because like if you tell your family and then it comes up and they defend you, they're complicit. Like, so yeah, if you committed a crime, you probably wouldn't tell your family if you thought you were gonna, the hope was that you were gonna continue getting away with it. Also, you wouldn't tell your family because the things that you did were horrible morally, and you understood that they were horrible morally, but obviously didn't care enough to not do it. Like, that's another thing. Like, obviously, if you're not telling your family members and stuff, like, that you did this experimentation, that you took part in it in any way, like, then you know it was wrong and bad and you shouldn't have done it. But you did it anyway. That's not a moral conundrum. You're just a bad person. So, here's where the trigger warning comes in. Obviously, like the last video, which I put the triggering stuff in this format too. Basically everything except things related to sexual assault is in here. The trigger warning, all-encompassing one, will go in the description. But again, if anything in the description box triggers you, you should stop watching this video now. So this is a timeline and history of the experiments. Heinz Haber was Strockhold's prized protege, as I said. They share authorship on a number of papers, scientific papers, and shared work experience on the subject of low-pressure experimentation, which was one of the human experimentations. In some of his work, he quoted data that was gathered in those experiments without any qualm or protestation of morals, and never spoke out against them during his lifetime. Nor, as we discussed, did he tell his family, or at least his youngest son. But the point here to elaborate is, even if you sit here and argue that he didn't participate in the experiments themselves, he still used the data. He still knew of them. He found it completely okay to use the data acquired in such a manner. Like, does that not say something? He's a Nazi. He should have been not in this country, at least. But yeah, so never spoke out against them. Even he never said anything about them, even when colleagues of his, like Alfred Rudolph, I believe, yeah, was investigated for similar stuff, and I guess somebody tattled on him and didn't tattle on Haber. And so the U.S. actually had to do something, and they revoked his U.S. citizenship and deported him back to Germany to be prosecuted. And Germany was like, you know, we don't really feel like it. You're free. Do whatever you want. And he just lived a happy life for the rest of his life in Germany. Despicable, isn't it? You know that, I don't know if I said it in the last video. I don't care. The United States, over the years, has prosecuted more Nazis than all of the countries in Europe combined, and that includes Germany itself, which was supposed to prosecute the war criminals. Like, they were supposed to have the jurisdiction. They just didn't. They didn't do it. And this was not like directly post-war period, by the way. This was like decades later. So everyone dropped the ball on this, and we are again seeing the results of dropping said ball across the world today. White supremacists think it's okay to exist. So here's another thing. He was an adaptive opportunist who claimed that he always wanted to emigrate to the United States. The reason why I say he was an adaptive opportunist is because while he was saying that and claiming that, he'd also applied for a professorship in Germany at the same time. You don't apply for like long-term jobs like a professorship. It was long-term at that time. I don't want to get into what it is like now, especially since I'm like not into all the details. But yeah, it was like sometimes a lifetime position, you know. Why would you apply for that sort of thing and be like, my goal was to go to America this whole time? No, it wasn't. You're just saying that to cover your ass. Ridiculous. So yeah, so he probably would have said anything to save his ass at any point in time. Just saying. And the evidence of his participation in the experiments is pretty damning from what I saw, but unfortunately it's not conclusive enough for Nazi apologists to agree on anything more than him having knowledge of it, and that's because of how he used the data in his scientific research. But I found multiple thesis papers on the subject. I requested to see copies of some of them, but that was like I said, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I still have not heard back. If I do hear back, I will update everyone. But you can see some of them online. What I wanted was like the sources that they were quoting and stuff like that. But yeah, anyway, moving on. It confirms he performed some of the experiments in order to gather research data for the General Luftwaffe Institution for Aviation Medicine, which is where he went to work for when he was shot down. He stayed with the Luftwaffe, but he went to the science side instead of continuing to fly. Yeah. The experiments Haber would have participated in started in 1942. And that's around the time period where he would have been that's when he joined. Yeah. Words. These were part of the Luftwaffe's desire to find a way to prevent and treat hypothermia for the first ones. And hypothermia was like a big problem for them because their pilots and stuff were getting shot down over water, and some of the fighting was obviously Russia. So, and a lot of it was like north, so Norway, like basically cold waters, and their pilots were falling into the water and alive, completely fine, and dying of hypothermia. And they didn't really they weren't really able at that point to continuously supply skilled pilots to the Luftwaffe. Like, they were kind of desperate for that, to be able to reuse their pilots. So doing that was pretty important to them. Hypothermia treatment, I mean. Prisoners in these experiments were forced to sit in tanks of freezing water for up to 3 hours. Once they were frozen, they underwent different methods of rewarming. Many did not survive. You can look up the methods of rewarming yourself. I didn't really want this to become like a long trauma dump, basically. I mean, I read stuff like that all the time, but if that's what you want to do, you can look into it more yourself. But the hypothermia experiments were meant to simulate conditions the Germans suffered on the Eastern Front. Oh, yeah, the Eastern Front with snow and stuff, Russian winter, because they decided to invade Russia at winter time, or like right on the cusp of it. Brilliant. Also brilliant to open up multiple fronts on both sides of your territory at the same time. They often experimented on Russians because they thought maybe their genetics gave them a superior resistance to the cold. See, this is where, like, this is what pisses me off, because there'll be people, especially from like my mom's generation, who will be like, the Nazis were horrible, but you have to admit that this and this that they did was smart or good or useful. And it's like, okay, but like, they believed this stuff. Genetic superior resistance to the cold. They were just more used to it, and they knew how to survive in it. Like, they'd encountered it before multiple times. Germans just hadn't. They had no idea how to cope with it. They had no reason to know how to cope with it up until that point. Eugenics is the stupidest science ever. It's not even a science, obviously. It's a pseudoscience, but yeah. I have lots of words. I'm keeping most of them to myself to keep this not going super long. In a letter from Roscher, who was a scientist who was working on the experimentation, obviously since he's writing about them, he describes submerging people dressed in fighter pilot uniforms in freezing water. Some were completely underwater and others submerged just to the head. As you can imagine, many victims died because they were frozen and drowning. Like, it just... They didn't even use common sense in these horrible experiments, because they didn't care about the cost of human life, because it wasn't like their people, they're perfect Aryans. So the loss was okay. In fact, it was probably encouraged. Like, oh, we lost another one. That's just one less, you know? But yeah, I mean, if you read into some of the experimentation, you'll see that it's like sadistic little boys who were given free run of what wasn't human, stuff that doesn't feel pain, and they just ran with it. Because some of their experiments literally have no reason to them, like, other than the people who were doing them was like, yeah, all right, I want to see how this goes. I want to do this. Like, it had no benefits. It was not scientifically sound. You can look into this yourself. I probably could have pulled some of the documents for the Nuremberg trials on the experiments, but I'll do that in another video. Anyway, the point is, they were not little boys, and they were not experimenting on things that couldn't feel things. They were experimenting on actual human beings. And this point right here, the prisoners evacuated. I thought I caught all of them, but that's from the last presentation, so please ignore that. Haber would also have participated in the seawater experiments, which were conducted in an attempt to study various methods of making seawater drinkable for downed pilots. Because like I said, their pilots were getting downed over the ocean and would need water, and when they had no water, because they bailed out of their airplane, and so they'd die of dehydration or be found like seriously ill. And again, they needed to keep their pilots alive so they could reuse them, because the resources to have new pilots they were dwindling. It was dwindling at that point. The victims of this particular experiment were deprived of food and only given filtered seawater. A group of 90 Roma suffered from this. This is, of course, not all of the victims, but I wanted to make a note that the Roma and Sinti were also persecuted and are also victims of the Holocaust. They even have their own name for it, which I can't recall off the top of my head. Words. Anyway, they were taken from the camps and experimented on like this. It left them gravely injured, and they were observed licking freshly mopped floors for water because they were that dehydrated. Imagine being so thirsty and in need of hydration that you can drop all of the societal mores and hygienic knowledge and common sense and human instinct about disease and germs and polluted water, drinking dirty water and stuff. The thirst that you have overwhelms all of that to the point that you're licking a floor. And the fact that there were human beings that could do this to other human beings and just record it like scientifically with a scientific tone of voice, with no empathy, with just apathy, is chilling. But these were the types of individuals that our government decided needed to take us to the moon. A Holocaust survivor described how the victims would have trouble eating because of ingesting the salt water and what it did to their insides and organs. And they would desperately seek out any source of water they could find, including old floor rags. So, again, like my last point, imagine how thirsty you have to be squeezing water out of dirty floor rags. But wait, there is more experiments. Yes, obviously they can't just stop it too. High altitude experiments were performed in order to see if pilots who ejected at high altitudes could be resuscitated. Because obviously you can take from that pilots were having to eject at a high altitude and damage was being done to them, or they were dying because of the effects of the high altitude. And so they were like, well, that's not good. Let's do some experiments on people. A low pressure chamber was used to simulate high altitude conditions of up to 68,000 feet. That was originally in kilometers, but I have trouble with numbers already, so I converted it for all of us, or for some of us if there are any Europeans watching this. Anyone from any other continent. I'm terrible with words. It was rumored that vivisections were performed on the survivors of the initial experiment. So the first experiment that was done, because there were multiple rounds of each experiment, there was a lot done. So the first ones who were chosen to be experimented on in this way were all if you survived the ordeal that they put you through, they then killed you and pulled you apart to look at your insides. In a letter to Himmler, Rascher, as the same scientist from before, explains one of the results where the victim was suffocated while he and another unnamed scientist watched and took note of the man's reactions. He was described as 37 and in good health. Take that as you will, because obviously he was an inmate at a concentration camp at Dachau that was pulled out of the line. So in good health probably meant that he was relatively healthy in comparison to other inmates, which is not saying very much. As he began to lose oxygen, he wiggled his head for 4 minutes, and then he began suffering from cramps and passed out. He then lay unconscious, breathing only 3 times per minute, until he stopped breathing 30 minutes later. He then turned blue and foamed at the mouth. Rascher then autopsied him. The reason I drew all of that out in the explanation is to appall you, basically. So these people spent, it didn't detail, the source I found didn't detail how long they stood there observing this man as he went through all of this, dying in front of them slowly. But they did. They just sat there and watched him and took things down as though he was like inconsequential, because he was to them. It doesn't even mention his name. But yeah, they stood there and they took all of this down, and then they autopsied him. This is how thorough they were. This is how little they cared about people. This is what they did. This is what Nazis are. So I hope none of you are out there sympathizing with them. They're dirtbags. Himmler ordered the experiments to continue because apparently he really enjoyed reading that letter. That particular letter is what made him be like, ooh, these are really good experiments. Continue. But he specified that they should be performed on inmates condemned to death. If one could be successfully revived, he would be pardoned to concentration camp for life. Oh, thank you. What a gift. So basically, if you were if you're an inmate condemned to death, they put you in like a special block away from people, or at least they did at most of the camps, and then they executed you firing squad style. They did not put you in gas chambers, and also Dachau didn't have gas chambers. But yeah, so that is what they would do, which some might argue is preferable to spending years in a concentration camp dying slowly of malnutrition, starvation, abuse, disease, dysentery, dehydration. I could go on. But also, arguably, if you were condemned even to concentration camp for life, that gave you at least some sort of slim chance at survival if you could see an end to this, if you could see an end to all of this. But some people couldn't. If prisoners survived the experiments, they were often killed and dissected. Some prisoners were subject to repeat experimentation if they survived the experimentation and also weren't killed to be dissected. So let's go back to the last point where Himmler said that it should be performed on inmates condemned to death, and if one was successfully revived, he would be pardoned to concentration camp for life. Here they are, killing and autopsying the survivors. So it didn't matter, I guess, if you survived or not. I mean, maybe some people survived, but I haven't seen their accounts. There are also photos, by the way. I didn't include them. But there's a lot of photos out there of the actual experiments because they documented things with photographs. I don't know if there's any film out there, but there's definitely photographs. And they were used, a lot of them were used in the war trials. But if you want to see that stuff or you're curious about it, the USHMM, Holocaust Memorial Museum, they have a really great website. They also have really great videos. But yeah, they have a really great website that has a huge encyclopedia about the Holocaust, and this, I think, falls into that territory, so you can find write-ups and stuff there. Yes, moving on. The next, like I said, there were experiments that were just performed because it was like kids were given free reign of stuff, and they were like, I wonder what would happen if I did this. It's sort of like if your parents aren't home and you're with like a sibling and you're like, you know what? I've always wanted to see what a bottle of Coke does when you put Mentos in it. Like I've seen it on video and stuff, but I would totally like love to see it in person, and they're not here. So let's do it. Except if it was of a completely sadistic nature. Like there was no benefit to you putting Mentos in Coke and making it explode. You knew it would explode. There was no point to it other than your satisfaction at seeing it explode. That's where they were at for a lot of things. Like here. They performed surgery without anesthetic on the prisoners just to see how they would react and how they would endure, like how long they could hold out against shock, stuff like that. The experiments were even monitored inhumanely with thermometers put into their orifices, heart monitors, and other equipment. And yes, I mean all orifices. Some of them, I don't think I included it in there. I definitely didn't. Some of them for the hypothermia experiments and stuff were just like tossed into the Baltic with monitors on them instead of even a controlled environment. So we get to my conclusion. What do you think? Is he a war criminal? I believe he is. I think it's highly unlikely that the protege of the man who was like over these experiments and stuff, especially when he was there, I think it's highly unlikely that he of all people sat out on what was basically pioneering science. They were finding a cure for hypothermia, and yeah, so it would have been seen as like really new and heady stuff. So yeah, I think he definitely would have participated. And even if you think he didn't, or you argue that he didn't, because there's no proof of it, that no like conclusive physical proof where he admits it or anything like that, then you can just look at his papers. He used the data. Like I said at the beginning, he used data from human experimentation, and scientists aren't gonna they're not gonna sit there and just slap random data into their scientific papers that they're publishing for like the scientific community to read. They'd be laughed at, especially if it came out that the data was faked. Have you not? I mean, you've seen that in modern times. It hasn't changed. So yeah, he would definitely know where that data came from in order to make sure that it was legitimate data gathered from legitimate experiments. So there's no way he didn't know. So he's complicit, at least in the fact that he used the data, and he didn't seem to find it morally objectionable that the data was obtained by experimenting on human beings. Probably because he subscribed to the Nazi ideology of subhumans, which again, in my opinion, he's a war criminal. He should have been prosecuted at Nuremberg. He was not. Instead, he was allowed into the United States. And we used him to help get us to space because he used his knowledge of, I mean, that's another thing. He developed medicine for outer space. Where do you think he got that knowledge from? You think he just got it from reading papers? No. All the experiments that I said have stuff to do with the things that it leads into the research and stuff that you need in order to make sure astronauts are safe and taken care of in space. Does it not? So, yeah. He didn't get that from just reading stuff. Yeah, he never expressed any outrage. He never expressed any remorse. Nothing. Oh, it cut off. Oh, there we go. Huh. Yeah. So, in my opinion, his status as a revered scientist, any awards or accolades he has should be revoked because he's a Nazi and he's a war criminal. And those two things don't deserve to be celebrated. And celebrating them gives off the wrong message. And we've been giving off the wrong message worldwide for decades. So maybe it's time to rectify that. Any and all information about him should reflect that he was a Nazi and that he probably participated in these experiments. It's just despicable. We need to face our history, and part of our history, unfortunately, is harboring Nazis and using their human experimentation results in order to get a boost on the Soviet Union to get our people into space and to the moon. That's basically what it amounted to. We decided that going to the moon was more important than holding on to our moral values, was more important than the fact that so many of our men died fighting the Nazis in this war, and we just brought them all into our country. It's basically like spitting in their faces, honestly. It's spitting in the faces of all of our generations, especially if you consider the era of Werner von Braun, where he was basically idolized. He was on TV. He was like America's golden boy for many years. And there are still boomers and stuff out there who definitely idolize him. And it's just... I can't remember where I was going with that. But the point is, it's atrocious and it should be addressed and changed. And the fact that it hasn't been addressed, even though the war ended in 1945 and it's now 2021, it's gross. It's a mishandling of everything. If we can't start there, like, I don't know, I guess I can't go on with that, but I just think that we should face our history and do the work that it takes to rectify it. All of it. And admitting that we had Nazis in the United States that influenced our citizens without our citizens totally knowing that they were Nazis, our politicians, our politics, that should be addressed. The damage it did and what is appearing these days should be addressed. And it all comes down to this. The CIA and the FBI harboring fugitives in our country and pretending they were not fugitives. Wonderful stuff, folks.